Ladies and gentlemen, we start the first session. Obviously, libraries have been written on the history of the Middle East. Our goal in this conference is to portray the events and bring them to new light, to analyze decisions and understand why, time after time, opportunities were missed. To explain the ongoing clashes between the Jewish state and the Arab Muslim countries. To understand the reasons for the failure of peace talks with the Palestinians. The religious war between Sunnis and Shiites, and the fight against the global jihad. Today, all these fundamental questions are under the spotlight and are in the heart of diplomatic debate. Recently, President François Hollande is planning to host a Middle East peace conference and propose a new initiative to resolve the Palestinian issue. The question is how France can be an honest broker after a scandalous vote in UNESCO that denied our deeply connection with Jerusalem, our capital, and also to our Temple Mount. You know, without understanding the historical events and decisions, we can't hope to understand the current issues confronting today the Middle East. We should avoid repeating the mistakes of the past to better address correct problems and ensure the stability of the entire region. Remember, the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the only outstanding issue in the region. During the last 6 decades, 23 conflicts have been recorded, including the war between Iranian Shiites and Iraqi Sunnis, which upset military and strategic stability and caused more than 1 million casualties. The domino effect of the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria has no link to the Arab-Israeli conflict. All the unrest in the Arab world is internal, local, social, religious, and tribal. It emerged as a result of corrupt leaders who for decades benefited from the poverty and ignorance of their citizens and stole from the national treasury by creating a police state and ruling by terror and cult of personality. With the collapse of the Sykes-Picot agreement, and despite the existing difficulties in international law, only viable state lines, defensible borders, and adequate safety measures will ensure the stability of the Middle East and the peace process with the Palestinians. The Europeans, as Michael said, and also the French initiative, have to take into consideration not only the objectives of the Arabs, but also threats, vital interest and security of the Jewish state. You know, the new picture of the region also presents Israel with some opportunities. And it is very important also to say. First, It raises the chances of developing security cooperation with pragmatic elements in the region and their efforts to confront the radicals, including Iran. You know, since the establishment, Israel remains an exemplary democratic state sharing the universal values of the Western world. The country has a burning desire to put an end to all hostilities with their neighbors and to achieve a lasting and sustainable peace. The Israelis want negotiations and are willing to make painful and important concessions provided that the other party supports an end of the conflict and agrees to Israeli demands for security and defense. In this context, it is clear that the Arab-Israeli conflict will not end if there is no willingness to make shared concessions and if these factors are not taken into account. The Arab countries and terrorist organizations should understand that they cannot defeat Israel on the battlefield. The Jewish state exists and will continue to exist with the Arab world. And only a negotiated peace through direct discussions with each Arab state and with the Palestinians will be the best formula to discuss. Well, now, to discuss historical overview of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, I invite Professor Shlomo Avineri from Hebrew University, Dr. Martin Kramer, President of Shalem College, Professor Ephraim Karsh from King's College London, and from Paris, Dr. Richard Rossin, former Vice President of European Academy of Geopolitics. We will start with Professor Avineri. Shlomo Avineri is well-known professor of political science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a member of the Israeli Academy of Science and Humanities. After the Yom Kippur War, he served as Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the government of Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Allon. In 1996, he received the Israeli Prize, the country's highest civilian decoration. His article in Haaretz reflected rich knowledge and different angles from history events and new idea, I think, out of the box. Among his many books, which have translated into many languages, The Social and Political Truth of Karl Marx, Hegel's Theory of the Modern State, Israel and the Palestinians, The Making of Modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, and the Foundation of Jewish State. Please, Professor Avineri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very generous introduction. Let me start by two comments which will try, I hope, to contextualize our discussion of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in a historical setting. When we talk about Sykes-Picot, we use a term in a generic way. When we talk about the political consequences, the borders, the states that were established in the wake of Sykes-Picot, we refer not only to the agreement of 1916, but also to what happened later. the Sèvres peace agreement with the Ottoman Empire, the San Remo Conference, both of them 1920, and of course in 1923, Lausanne Agreement, which finally more or less settled the legacy of the defeated Ottoman and Turkish country. So when we talk about Sykes-Picot, the map of Sykes-Picot is very different from the map which eventually emerged in 1923. But the principles and the interest and the considerations and the context are more or less the same. That's point number one. Point number two has to do with the context of World War I and the ensuing peace treaties. The peace treaties which were achieved after the end of World War I, the Versailles Treaty with Germany, Saint-Germain with Austria, Trianon with Hungary, and Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire, which eventually was overtaken by events, are basically victors' treaties in which the victors, the Allied, mainly Britain, France, and to a certain degree United States and even Japan, coerced the defeated countries to accept a diktat. This may not be politically correct to say today, because this was then utilized in Germany, especially by the Nazis and others, but the Versailles Agreement, and this has effect also on the Middle East, was very unusual when you look in terms of diplomatic history. When you compare the Versailles Treaty to treaties that were signed in 1814, 15 in Vienna, the Vienna Congress, the Paris peace treaties, 1956, after the end of the Crimean War, the Berlin Congress of 1878, after the end of the Turkish-Russian War, and some other treaties. In all of those treaties and conferences, both the victors and the vanquished were at the table and negotiate. And obviously those who won the war had a better situation and were much more powerful. We could see it in 1815, we could see it in 1878, also 1856. The uniqueness and the problematics of Versailles and some of the other treaties was that the Versailles Conference, and we tend to forget it, was a conference in which the victors negotiated with each other, because French interests and British interests and American interests were not the same. Only after they agreed among themselves were the Germans told to come and sign or else. And the German government that had to accept that diktat was not that of the Kaiser and Ludendorff and Hindenburg, but was a social democratic and liberal government, which with terrible consequences for German politics, because this Versailles diktat, and as a diktat it was viewed not only later by the Nazis, but also by social democrats, created the atmosphere and the legitimacy for the unease in Germany, not only among right-wing nationalists, but also among socialists, communists, and Democrats. So one has to realize that we deal here not only with agreements, but we deal here with agreements which were victors' agreements. And apropos Sykes-Picot, what is today a little bit forgotten, is that while the Russians, Tsarist Empire, in 1916, was not part of the agreement, but the agreement also gave Russia some standing and influence, including a standing in Istanbul, in Constantinople, a Russian dream from the time of Empress Catherine. And the fact that, again, one should remember it, Sykes-Picot was a secret agreement, and it was not known until in November 1917, the Bolshevik government, a few weeks after taking power in St. Petersburg, published it. So we deal here not with an open agreement, not with a conference, but with a secret diplomatic agreement, which took months and months, from November 1915 to April 1916, to work out. So it was a very major achievement of secret diplomacy. The third point I want to make is to view the Sykes-Picot Agreement in a really wider context. What were the consequences of Sykes-Picot for the region? and they were beyond the borders. An attempt, eventually, to translate European Westphalian state systems to the Middle East, to create regions and areas which, after Sykes-Picot and Sanremo and Lausanne, became French and British mandates and eventually became states. And the model was that you can translate or you can transfer the European experience of modern sovereign nation states to the Middle East and create discrete and separate sovereign nation states under the general umbrella that all of them will be Arab nation states. Now, when we talk about Westphalian nation states, when we talk about the concept of modern state sovereignty, which was more or less expressed in the Peace Treaty of Westphalia and was already mentioned earlier, of 1648, what is symptomatic of the modern nation state, or what I would like, and can be called the Westphalian nation state? It really makes two statements. First of all, internal, and the other external. The internal statement is that within a certain territory, loyalty to state authority is above loyalty to family, tribe, region, religion, ethnicity. That you accept the authority of the state, not that it is the only authority. Family and religion and ethnicity and region are respected, but they are subservient to the hegemonic loyalty to the state. And the second aspect, which is external and is really a consequence of the first, is that when it comes to the external relationship, it is a state and not subsystems like region or ethnicity or religion, which represent the state outside. This is a modern idea of the nation state. And the idea which came out of Sykes-Picot and the agreements, especially the Lausanne Agreement, was that entities which were set up by British and French imperialists and were called Iraq or Syria and Lebanon will eventually, being all of them Arab nation states, behave like Western Westphalian nation states. And when those mandates and regions achieved independence, it was obviously in the interest of the powers that be, usually rather elitist, notable politicians in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, to maintain the status quo. And for 100 years, more or less, the status quo was maintained. Despite the fact that it was mentioned earlier, it was challenged, especially by the Muslim Brotherhood. This is not a new phenomenon. But the idea was that those are the states, and those are the borders, and those are the maps of the Middle East, which all of us have in our mind. I want to remind you, this is not the map of Sykes-Picot. It's Sykes-Picot as corrected later by Sèvres and Sanremo and Lausanne. And what we see today, and this goes beyond Sykes-Picot, is the attempt to establish discrete, recognizable, and coherent nation states in the Arab region is being challenged. And it is challenged by the forces which were overlooked by Sykes-Picot and its inheritors. Because both Sykes-Picot and all the agreements which I mentioned earlier totally overlooked geographical, demographic, ethnic, religious, cultural, historical diversities. They viewed the region of Iraq as being more or less uniform, or the region of Syria more or less uniform. Lebanon a little bit more complicated, but again, that there is a clear Christian Arab majority, as it was then in Lebanon. And this should be remembered, the local population was never asked. Sykes-Picot and the treaties after that not only imposed a victor's system, British and French interest, on the defeated Ottoman and later Turkish state, but they imposed a system in which the local population was never asked what they want. In plebiscite, etc. In Europe, it was sometimes different. In contested areas in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in the successor states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were plebiscites. Not always worked out very well, but they existed. Here, there was no plebiscite, no referendum. The population was never asked. And when we saw what happened in the Arab Spring, we saw that when the unity of countries set up according to Western imperial interests was challenged, the identity of the Westphalian nation-state disintegrated. I have immediately to say in parenthesis, not in a country like Egypt, because Egypt was not set up by the Western imperialists. Egypt is an historical entity, problematic, with a Christian Coptic minority which has its own problems, but nobody challenges the way that the Copts are Egyptians, are probably more Egyptian than the Muslim Egyptians in historical terms. And therefore, all the problems of Egypt are internal problems, serious problems. But nobody challenges the existence, or more or less the borders and the identity of Egypt. Egypt is 5,000 years old. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and let me add, Libya and Sudan are modern structures set up according to Western imperial interests. And I don't want to overstate the case, but what we see today is that the imperial and post-imperial interregnum is coming to an end. And when it's being challenged by the wishes, which may be murderous and terrible and fanatical, but they are the real wishes of at least some groups in this population. I want to suggest, again, as I mentioned, Libya and Sudan. Libya, post-Gaddafi, is disintegrating not because the various groups in Libya cannot come to an agreement, but because Libya as an entity is an Italian invention of 1911, 1912, when Italy grabbed in the Western imperial struggle for Europe, for Africa, two provinces, two vilayets of the Ottoman Empire, Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, which are very different in history, in culture, even in the Arabic dialect spoken in the two. And the idea that this is Libya, this is not an Arab word, this is basically a Latin Italian name. And after the strongman disappeared, people relate to their identities. And what we have today in Libya is 3 governments, 2 parliaments, who knows how many armies and how many militias. And Sudan again. Sudan, which was set up on independence as an Arab nation state, is basically a concoction of British imperialism at the end of the 19th century, when they were able to conquer Sudan and put down the first Islamic rebellion, the Mahdi, against the West. And we see already South Sudan, not yet consolidated. We see issues of Darfur, and Sudan, like Libya, is not anymore what it was. And in Yemen, which is more complicated again, we see a disintegration of Yemen according to geographical, historical, cultural, and religious groups. So we see today not just that borders are changing, not only that, but the very idea that at least 5 Arab states, which were modeled on a Western model, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, and Lebanon, whose identity was always very problematic, it had also impact on Lebanon, are being challenged. Now, the attempts today by the West to think that if you have an agreement about a unified government in Libya, or you're going to have an agreement in Syria, those are pieces of papers. We're dealing here with much more profound developments. When challenged, Iraqis don't feel any more like Iraqis. Certainly the Kurds have the opportunity in the north, and they have a de facto state. They don't think that the most important thing is independence or a seat at the UN. The most important thing is control of the territory. And the Kurds in North Iraq, KRG, the Kurdish regional government, is now controlling its territory. The army of Baghdad, for what it is worth, does not have a foothold in the Kurdish areas. There are de facto embassies in Erbil, the capital. Thank you. The capital of the Kurdish region, and the Kurdish region has embassies, that's called representatives, in most European countries. So we deal here Iraq disintegrating, and the issue between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq is not yet finished. And the situation in Syria, which is changing every day. The last day we have seen that Al-Qaeda is trying to limit the Daesh, so we're going to have another aspect of the local war. I do not know what the future of either Syria or Libya is going to be. And to suggest what the future is going to be is stupid. But I think I can say something negative. To imagine that Syria will once again be a more or less unified, coherent polity is probably, I'm being careful, probably out of the question. Whether the fact that Assad is able to maintain himself now with Russian help, but not only with Russian help, before that, against the expertise of many experts, including in Israel. We remember a former Israeli Minister of Defense who says that Assad is going to disappear within a few weeks. And he had all the information which also us didn't have, but some of us were right and he was wrong. Because we deal here not with a daily Modi'in intelligence information, but we deal with historical processes. So, to try to sum up, the Middle East, when the Arab Spring started, people were comparing what was happening, and very dramatically and very hopefully, first in Tunisia, and then of course in Egypt at Tahrir Square, people were comparing it to 1989 in Central Eastern Europe, the end of communism, and even the name the Arab Spring comes from the European 1848 Spring of Nations. This was unfortunately wishful thinking. What we're saying today is something much more profound. We're seeing that the state system in the Middle East is disintegrating, and if you really want a European parallel, and one should be, of course, careful and not Eurocentric, and not everything that happens in Europe is going to happen the same way here. But if you look for a possible parallel in the area, it is the 17th century in Europe, the wars of religion, the disintegration of the old feudal system, the old Roman, German Roman Empire, and the emergence of modern states. It took some time. Is it going to be the same outcome in the Middle East? I do not know. But again, without Schadenfreude, but with, I think, a sober mind, we should recognize that the Middle East, as we have known it, with Arab nation states on a Westphalian model, is not what's going to be the future of the area. It's going to be an area of long transitions, not necessarily to where we know it's going to be, but it's changing. It's going to create, and has already created, a lot of suffering, a lot of murderousness. If you want to compare it to what happened to Syria, the 30 Years' War in Europe was as murderous, especially to the German lands, and what's happening now in Syria. And we should be very careful about predictions, and we should be even more careful of thinking that you can go back to what was set up as an imperialist system and then post-imperialist system in the area. We're in for a very long period of instability, and one should be very, very careful of what one sees and how one responds to it. Thank you very much.